All of my life, I've not only attended weekly worship and Bible classes, but special activities such as gospel meetings and vacation Bible schools. Not just the ones we had at our own congregation, but those in the area. Now, it is possible that I had attended a lectureship at one of our colleges associated with our brotherhood at some time in my early years, but I have no memory of it. By the time I start remembering that, I remember my parents leaving me with an older lady at church because I had to go to school, and they went off to lectureship. Well, that changed in February 1968. I was a 15-year-old high school sophomore, and I, along with some other young people in our congregation, learned that Pat Boone would be leading the singing at a youth rally at the lectureship at Abilene Christian College, now university. The youth rally would be connected with the dedication of the brand new Moody Coliseum. It's had a capacity of almost 5,000 people. Well, a group of young people and adults traveled from southeastern Oklahoma to Abilene on Saturday before the lectureship began. We got there, stayed in a motel room. I certainly hope that motel is long gone because it was on its last legs then. We got up the next morning and went over to the College Church of Christ. It was adjacent to campus, still is. We got there. I don't think we were late, but we got there. The auditorium, large auditorium, was filled to overflowing. It seems like maybe even the chapel was filled, and we were taken to a large classroom, and this was not their first rodeo. They were prepared for this. They had the Lord's Supper prepared for this large group, all these different rooms. The sound was put into where we could hear the sermon. We sang along. Just starting the day, we encountered a large number of people. This was because in Abilene, Texas, there are several of our congregations, and there are many members of the Church of Christ. And at lecture time, and this was especially true back in the 60s, several thousand people would come from around the world to Abilene. Imagine that, going to Abilene in West Texas. In February, they would come and assemble for this lectureship. Well, on Sunday afternoon, we went over to the Coliseum. The doors would not be open until a certain time. Every crowd had gathered around. The doors opened, we all went in, found seats, and the Coliseum was filled to overflowing. There was an overflow room even for this event. The Coliseum was dedicated, had all that to go through. The youth rally began. Ira North, one of the best-known preachers in our brotherhood, spoke. So happened that he had known Pat Boone when Pat Boone was growing up. But Pat Boone led the singing. I was starstruck, I have to admit that. I got to see Pat Boone, got to see a celebrity. He was only 300 or 400 feet away from me. But anyway, it was a great event. We attended some other lectures before we left on Monday to go back home because we were students in school. I have attended a great many other lectureships over the years, but this one was special because in some ways it was my first. It was a memorable trip. From the Gospel of Luke, we learn that Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem every year for Passover. The only account we have from Jesus' boyhood was when he was 12 years old and went with his family to Passover in Jerusalem. Now, it's very likely that he went with them on the previous trips. But Jesus, although the Son of God, was a little bitty boy. But at age 12, he, like other young Jewish boys, was coming of age. He was beginning to learn some of the responsibilities that a Jew would have in manhood. This trip was certainly memorable. He caused a stir on this trip by not leaving for home when his family did. There was a large entourage, no doubt, of people traveling together. His parents just assumed he was somewhere else in the group. Nighttime came, he wasn't. So they went back, looked for him. It took a while. They found him. He was there with the teachers of the law, with others there in the temple courts. He was listening to them. He was asking questions, answering questions. They were amazed at this young 12-year-old. Jesus' mother was not so amused. She's questioning him. Why did you do this to us? And Jesus just says, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? Wouldn't you have suspected this would be where I was? Well, they didn't really understand what was going on, we're told. And whether or not this was Jesus' first Passover trip, it was the most memorable of his youth. There would be many more trips to Jerusalem for Passover, including those during his ministry. As Jesus comes to the end of his ministry, he will observe his last Passover. What was Passover? The Passover meal was an annual memorial to the Exodus, when the Lord passed over the Israelite homes and took the firstborn of each Egyptian family, provoking Pharaoh to let the Israelites escape into the desert. And after the Israelites left Egypt, instructions were very soon given. Each year, you are to observe this Passover. Instructions were given on how to do it. And for centuries, when Israel was doing what they were supposed to do, they observed the Passover. During the time of Jesus, he observed the Passover on a regular basis. And we read in the Gospel of Luke again, verses 14 through 16, when the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. This would be Jesus' last Passover. Alan Black observes, Jesus' last meal before his death was the most important meal in the Jewish calendar. Our text today concerns Jesus' last Passover. We are in Mark, not in Luke. Mark chapter 14, we'll be reading from verses 12 through 21. On the first day of unleavened bread, on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover? So he sent two of his disciples, telling them, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, the teacher asked, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there. The disciples left, went into the city, and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table, eating, he said, I tell you the truth. One of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. They were saddened. And one by one they said to him, surely not I. It is one of the 12, he replied, one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. In our text, we first see preparations for the Passover, verses 12 through 16. A question is asked about the Passover. It is Passover time. And so the disciples ask, where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover? They knew that Jesus wanted to observe the Passover. They would observe it with him. Where do you want us to do this? Matthew, as he relates this incident, also says that the disciples asked where Jesus wanted them to prepare. Matthew has the same account. We realize that Jesus followed the law of Moses and observed the Passover. Well, Jesus responds with instructions about this particular Passover. He says, go in to town. We learn from one of the other Gospels that Peter and John were the ones sent. But he says, go into the city. You will see a man carrying a jar of water. That was an unusual thing. The women got to carry the jars of water. A man might be going along and he would have a leather pouch of water. But it was unusual to see a man carrying a jar of water. And when you get there, Jesus says, well, follow him, and he will lead you to a particular place. And when you get there, say to the owner of the house, the teacher asked. No name, the teacher asked. Where is my guest room where I can eat the Passover with my disciples? Now, William Barclay says the upper room on a house was basically a smaller box on top of a bigger box. The houses were flat-roofed. Some of them would have a room built on top that would naturally be a little bit smaller than the one below. The Passover had to be eaten within the walls of Jerusalem, and so a place did have to be found. Now let's keep in mind that several thousand Jews have come to Jerusalem to eat the Passover. They had to find a place to do it within the walls of Jerusalem. So Peter and John are the two that go. They find everything just as Jesus had said it would be. Now, as we read the instructions of Jesus here, I think we are reminded, we should be, of chapter 11, verses 1 through 6, where Jesus sent two of the disciples to bring a coat that he would ride in his entry into Jerusalem. In both cases, he sent two disciples. He told them exactly what they should encounter and gave them a message for the responsible party. In both cases, the disciples' mission went just as Jesus had said. Did Jesus have miraculous knowledge of everything that would take place? That is certainly a possibility. It is not stated that that is what happened. Jesus could have made some prearrangements. But at any rate, Jesus always knew what was going on. In fact, the only thing we find that Jesus does not know in the future is when he's going to come again. There's been some conjecture that this upper room could have been the house of Mary, mentioned in Acts chapter 12. As you may recall, she was the mother of Mark, who we believe to be the author of this gospel. That is simply conjecture. It's Passover time. You have to have a place to observe the Passover. Jesus says, here is what you need to do to get ready for the Passover, to find the place. And everything happened just as Jesus had said. Well, when the room is found and they find it all ready to go for them, there is still the preparation of the meal. The meal will consist of a lamb, of some bitter herbs, that doesn't sound so good at all, and some other things, including some wine to drink. Part of the preparation, the big part of the preparation, would be taking the Passover lamb to the temple for the ritual slaughter. The priest would slaughter the animal, sprinkle the blood against the base of the altar, and offer the fat on the altar. The animals were dressed with the legs unbroken and the head still attached to the carcass, and returned to the worshipers. Because of the great number of people there for the Passover, the slaughter had to be separated from the place of eating. The only stipulation was that the lamb had to be eaten in Jerusalem, where borders were expanded to accommodate the crowds. The worshiper would roast the lamb for the late evening meal. So everything is ready, made ready for the Passover. And then that evening, Jesus and the 12 disciples get together to observe the Passover. Now, the Passover was a time of remembrance. Remembrance of God's deliverance of the Israelites from Egyptian slavery. It was a somber event in some ways, but also a joyous event. They had been delivered. This particular Passover was a bit different. It turned different very quickly. It's evening. Jesus is there with the 12. They were reclining at the table. Now, forget what you have seen in all the famous paintings. In those days, people did not sit at the table like we do. They reclined around a table. I would not want to eat that way, but that's the way they did it. That was the practice. But they're around this table, this low table. They're on the floor, probably on pillows, rugs, whatever. They are eating the meal, the Passover meal. And Jesus says something that really brings down the mood. I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. Now, Jesus had been talking for some time about his upcoming suffering, his upcoming death. The disciples did not understand the predictions. They even kind of rebelled against the whole concept. But here, Jesus says, one of you is going to make this death possible. One of you are going to betray me into the hands of the enemy. Imagine the reaction. We're told about the reaction, aren't we? Here, the betrayer has infiltrated their midst and is eating with them. Imagine that. This small group here, and one is the enemy. Well, Earl McMillan says the prediction made the disciples exceedingly curious. They were baffled, perhaps even dumbfounded, that anyone, particularly one so close, could do such a thing. They each reacted only to the possibility of himself doing the deed, not the likelihood of anyone else in the group. Such an attitude can only be commended. But Jesus says it's one of the 12. And 11 of these men said, "Surely not I." And that wording expects a negative answer. Surely not I. Jesus says it is one of the 12. And then he says, one who dips bread into the bowl with me. A big bowl was on the table. It had some food in it. The custom was to take a piece of bread, to dip it into the bowl, and eat. I'm sure there was no double dipping, hopefully not. Anyway, one who dips into the bowl with me. Now, more than likely all of the disciples did that, but certainly it would be one here sharing food with Jesus. In Matthew's account, we read these words, Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Similar wording to Mark. Then these words, then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." And Jesus replied, "You have said so." The Greek scholars say the reply of Judas is a little different than that of the others. Judas knows what he's about to do. He's already made the deal. We have here an allusion to Psalm 41:9. Even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me. One who dips into the bowl with me, one who eats with me. And so Jesus says, yes, one of you is going to do it. He says, this is written about him. This is in prophecy. This is going to happen. But he says, woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. Be better if he'd never been born. Wendell Willis said the prophecy of betrayal was Jesus' last attempt to turn Judas away from his chosen course. There's a lot we don't know about Judas, and a whole lot has been speculated. But Judas did have a choice. He was not predestined to betray Jesus. Jesus, in a way, gives him an opportunity to not betray him. But betrayal is according to Scripture. It doesn't excuse the betrayer. He will face the consequences. Passover was an annual reminder of God's deliverance of Israel. Jesus would very soon give himself for the deliverance of all for their sins. And so the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, "Get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch, as you really are. And then he says, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Each year, a family would take a lamb that was perfect. They would bring it to the temple. It would be sacrificed. They would eat the meat of this lamb. This year would be different, because the very Son of God would become the Passover lamb, truly perfect in every way, the only one who could give his life for the sins of others, because he had no sin. Passover the following year, for those who continued it, would not have the significance of this Passover or those preceding. It would soon pass away for the followers of Jesus. The old covenant had been replaced by a new and better covenant. And the old Passover sacrifice had been supplanted by the perfect sacrifice of the perfect Passover lamb. The observation of the last Passover provided the setting for a meal with a new meaning. And the Lord willing, that will be our study next week.